The scent of damp earth and fresh-cut stems was the only air Violet Jensen ever really wanted to breathe. Here, inside her sun-drenched Los Angeles shop, petal and stem, she was in control. Her hands, stained faintly green, moved with a practiced grace, coaxing a spray of delphiniums into a perfect arch. The vibrant life exploding from buckets all around her was a beautiful shield against the quiet ache of loneliness that sometimes settled in her chest after she locked the doors for the night. This shop was her sanctuary. A sharp ping from the laptop on her counter cut through the classical music playing softly from a small speaker. An order. Violet wiped her hands on her apron and clicked it open. The email was different. It was sterile, with no friendly greeting, and the sender was encrypted. The request was simple, yet absolute. A large bouquet of pure white lilies. A heavy crystal vase. The price offered was staggering, enough to cover her rent for 3 months. Then she saw the delivery address. A notorious villa tucked away in the highest peaks of the Hollywood Hills. Client P. Edwards. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Everyone in LA had heard whispers about the man who lived there, a man who moved in shadows and dealt in power. She should have refused. Should have deleted the email and forgotten it. But pragmatism won. It was just a delivery. Flowers were her language, and they spoke to everyone. An hour later, her modest delivery van felt small and clumsy as it climbed the winding, private road. The air grew thinner, the houses larger, until they were less like homes and more like fortresses. She pulled up to a set of immense, black iron gates. A camera swiveled to focus on her license plate. A moment of tense silence, and then the gates swung inward without a sound. The villa was a masterpiece of cold, modern architecture, all glass, steel, and stark white stone. It seemed to suck the warmth from the California sun. A man with a face like a clenched fist met her at the door and led her inside. The interior was cavernous and silent. Polished marble floors echoed her soft footsteps. The air was still and smelled of nothing at all. It was the most lifeless place she had ever been. He gestured toward a massive, black stone coffee table in the center of a vast living room. There. Violet nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She carefully unwrapped the bouquet, the scent of the lilies a fragile rebellion in the sterile air. She placed the arrangement in the center of the table, the crystal vase catching the light. It was a perfect splash of life in an ocean of emptiness. She turned to leave, and that's when she saw him. He hadn't made a sound. He just stood in the archway, a ghost in a perfectly tailored dark suit. Patrick Edwards. His presence was a physical force, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at her. His eyes, a startlingly clear, cold gray, held her captive. It wasn't a glance. It was an assessment, an excavation. It felt as if he were seeing something far beyond the florist standing awkwardly in his living room. For a split second, something flickered behind the icy control in his gaze, something raw, ancient, and unreadable. The silence stretched, becoming so heavy she could barely breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the flicker was gone. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. A dismissal. The guard escorted her out. Violet didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her, a chilling weight against her skin, all the way to the door. The next morning, Violet tried to bury the memory of him under a mountain of work. She trimmed thorns from a dozen blush-pink roses, her hands moving automatically. She breathed in the familiar, sweet scent of her shop, a perfume of life and growth that usually soothed her soul. But today, it couldn't erase the feeling of his cold, gray eyes. It was a phantom touch, a weight she couldn't shrug off. She told herself it was just a strange client, a one-time delivery. The money was in her account, a shocking sum that felt more like a mistake than a payment. She just needed to focus on the hydrangeas that needed watering. Then a shadow fell over her doorway. It wasn't a cloud. It was a car, a long, sleek black sedan that seemed to drink the very sunlight from the street. It was so out of place on her cheerful, bustling block that it looked like a tear in the fabric of reality. The engine was utterly silent. The door opened, and Patrick Edwards stepped out. He brought the chill of his villa with him. The warm, fragrant air in her shop seemed to curdle around his presence. The two customers browsing near the back fell silent, their chatter dying instantly. One of them, a regular, nervously clutched her purse and found the exit, scurrying away as if a predator had just entered the room. Patrick didn't even glance at her. His focus was entirely, terrifyingly on Violet. He walked toward her counter, his expensive shoes making no sound on the worn wooden floor. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the perfect, sharp crease in his dark trousers. "Miss Jensen," he said. His voice was calm, a low rumble that cut through the quiet. It wasn't a question. She swallowed, her hands tightening on the rose stems. The thorns pricked her skin. "Mr. Edwards, I was impressed with your work," he stated, his gaze sweeping over her shop, not with admiration, but with assessment. As if he were cataloging every petal, every leaf. The lilies were acceptable. Violet's heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. This wasn't a courtesy call. Men like him didn't make courtesy calls. He got straight to the point. "I want to offer you a contract. You will be the exclusive florist for all of my properties and events. Your shop will cater only to my needs. The compensation will be substantial enough that you will not require any other clients." It wasn't an offer. It was a command wrapped in the language of business. The words exclusive and only hung in the air, heavy as iron. He was buying her shop, her time, her world. The money he mentioned was a key, but it was for a cage. A beautiful, gilded cage. She knew, with a certainty that turned her blood to ice, that no was not an answer he would accept. She could see it in the unyielding set of his jaw, in the flat, final look in his eyes. Refusing him would be like refusing the tide. All she would do is drown. Her pragmatism, the trait that had kept her afloat her entire life, took over. She met his gaze, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "All right." A flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, passed through his eyes before the mask of indifference slid back into place. "My office will send you the paperwork. It is a formality. Our arrangement begins now." He turned and walked out as silently as he had come. The black car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the bright LA traffic. The shadow lifted. The bell on the door tinkled cheerfully, a sound from a world that no longer felt entirely hers. Violet looked down at her hand. A single drop of blood welled up where a thorn had pierced her skin, a tiny, crimson star against her palm. He hadn't just bought her flowers. He had bought her. Her life changed overnight. The first payment appeared in her bank account with so many zeros it looked like a typo. It was enough to erase every small, nagging debt she had. But the money felt cold, heavy. Her shop, once a place of joyful creation, now felt like a holding cell. Every customer who walked in felt like an intruder on his property. Every bouquet she made for someone else felt like a betrayal of their silent, suffocating contract. Her freedom vanished in pieces. First, the phone calls began. Summons, not orders, for deliveries at bizarre hours. 10 o'clock at night. 6 in the morning. Then, the cars started appearing. The same black sedan that had darkened her door, sent not to collect flowers, but to collect her. The first time it happened, she stood frozen on the curb, her arms full of gladiolus, as a silent driver held the back door open for her. She wasn't being given a ride, she was being escorted. Contained. Tonight she was arranging crimson roses in his living room. The villa was as silent and cold as ever, a mausoleum that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner, and nothing else. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady, a sharp contrast to the frantic flutter in her chest. She had placed the old, withered lilies on the counter to dispose of, and was now filling the exact same crystal vase with the new blooms. He was keeping it. The vase was a permanent fixture, a silent testament to the moment he had first laid eyes on her, an attempt to perfectly preserve it. Red roses. His voice came from behind her, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. She jumped, a half-cut stem falling from her hand. He had a talent for appearing from nowhere, a phantom in his own home. She turned to face him. He stood by the massive fireplace, his hands in his pockets, watching her with that unnerving intensity. "A classic choice," she said, her voice sounding thin and formal. He took a step closer. "What do they signify?" The question was a test. She knew the answer he wanted. Love. Passion. The stuff of poetry. But giving him that felt too intimate, like handing him a key to a room inside her he had no right to enter. "In the floral industry, they signify a high profit margin," she answered coolly, turning back to the arrangement. "They're always in demand." Silence. She could feel his displeasure radiating off him like a wave of cold. He moved again, stopping right beside the table. He was so close she could smell the crisp, clean scent of his shirt. "The lilies," he said, his voice a low command. "Why did you choose them for the first delivery?" Her hand stilled. This was it. The real question. She kept her eyes on the roses, on the careful placement of a stem. "The order specified a minimalist arrangement. Lilies have a strong architectural shape. They're elegant and they last for weeks if cared for properly." "That's not what I asked," he pressed, his voice dropping even lower, a velvet threat. "What do they mean?" She finally looked at him. His gray eyes were searching hers, demanding something she refused to give. He wasn't just the client, the boss. He was a man trying to force a connection, to find a shared, secret language. Her refusal to speak it was the only power she had left. "They can mean purity," she said, her tone clipped and professional, as if reciting from a textbook. "Or remembrance. It depends on the context." A flicker of profound disappointment crossed his face before it was replaced by the familiar icy mask. He had been searching for a feeling, and she had given him a fact. He looked from her to the roses sitting in his sister's vase, his jaw tight. He was the king of this cold, silent castle, and yet she, the florist, had denied him the one thing he seemed to want. He gave a sharp nod, the same dismissive gesture as the first day. "You may go." As the guard led her out into the night, Violet felt the invisible bars of her gilded cage press in. He didn't want her flowers. He wanted their soul. And he thought, somehow, that it was attached to hers. His control tightened like a knot. The next summons wasn't for the living room or a sterile hallway. It was for his private study, a room she sensed no one else was ever permitted to enter. The black car came for her just after dawn, and as she was led through the silent villa, she felt she was being taken deeper into the labyrinth, closer to its dark heart. The study was him. Dark wood, the scent of old books and something faintly like whiskey, and an unnerving, perfect order. Not a single paper was out of place on the massive mahogany desk. She placed her arrangement of bright yellow freesias next to a cold, silver laptop, the cheerful flowers looking like a tiny, defiant protest in the somber room. The scent of spring and rain filled the air, a gentle invasion of his sterile world. He wasn't there, but his presence was in every shadow. "Mr. Edwards has been delayed," the guard said from the doorway. "Wait here." The door clicked shut, leaving her alone. The silence was heavier in here, thick with unspoken things. Waiting felt like a punishment. She couldn't stand still. She walked along his bookshelf, her fingers ghosting over the leather spines of classics and books on economic theory. It felt like trespassing on his soul. Needing air, she moved to the tall windows at the back of the room. They overlooked a stone terrace she had never seen before. And beyond it, something glinted in the morning sun. It was a building made almost entirely of glass, tucked away behind a high stone wall, almost completely hidden from the main house. A glass house. Her heart gave a curious flutter. It didn't belong here. It was a structure of life and light attached to a fortress of stone and shadow. Drawn by an impulse she couldn't control, she found the glass door leading from the study to the terrace. It was unlocked. She slipped outside, the cool morning air a relief on her skin. She walked across the stones, her steps silent, until she stood before the glass house. She peered through a pane of clean glass, and her breath caught in her throat. It was another world. Inside was a riot of color and life, a humid, tangled paradise. Rare orchids with spotted petals dripped from hanging baskets. Enormous ferns unfurled in shades of impossible green. There were flowers she had only ever seen in botanical books, thriving in the carefully controlled warmth. It was a secret, living heart hidden within the villa's cold body. This immaculate garden, so full of warmth and tender care, was in complete opposition to the man himself. Who tended to this? Who loved these plants? "What are you doing here?" The voice was pure ice. It cut through the air, and she flinched, spinning around. Patrick stood on the terrace, not 10 feet away. He must have come through the study. For the first time since she'd met him, the mask was gone. His face was pale with a rage so profound it was terrifying. But beneath the fury, she saw something else flicker in his cold gray eyes, something she never expected to see. Raw, stark vulnerability. It was the look of a man whose deepest secret had just been discovered. He didn't yell. He didn't move closer. He simply grew colder, the air around him seeming to drop 10 degrees. The silence was more threatening than any shout could ever be. He wasn't just angry that she had found a garden. He was shattered that she had found this part of him. The discovery changed everything. She had stumbled past his walls and seen the hidden, fragile thing he protected so fiercely. He knew it. And as he stared at her, his expression a terrifying mix of fury and exposure, she understood that their strange, dangerous dance had just entered a new, far more complicated phase. She expected to be dismissed. Thrown out. Told never to return. But the summons came again the next day, and the silent guard didn't lead her to the study or the living room. He led her through the house and out onto the stone terrace, stopping at the glass door of the greenhouse. He unlocked it and held it open for her. Inside, Patrick was waiting. He stood near a bench cluttered with small terracotta pots and bags of soil, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. It was the first time she had ever seen him without his suit jacket, and the sight was disarmingly human. He didn't look at her. He was busy pruning the leaves of a towering fiddle-leaf figure. The sharp snip of his shears was the only sound in the humid air. This became their new ritual. He never spoke of the day she found his secret, but he no longer hid it from her. After arranging the flowers in the main house, she would be brought here. He would work on his plants in silence, and she would simply stand in his world, a silent observer. It was a test, she knew. A strange, quiet interrogation. One afternoon, surrounded by the overwhelming scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, she couldn't bear the silence any longer. She walked over to a cascade of delicate, moth-like orchids. "Phalaenopsis," she said, her voice soft. She ran a gentle finger along a waxy petal. "They need indirect light. And they hate having wet roots." He stopped what he was doing. She felt his gaze on her, heavy and intense. She didn't turn to look at him, keeping her eyes on the flower. It felt safer this way. This was her language, her territory. Here in this glasshouse, she wasn't just the florist he had bought. She was an expert. A strange, dangerous intimacy began to bloom in the humid air between them. They spoke a language of botany and beauty, a fragile truce. She would identify the rare plants, offering small pieces of knowledge. He would listen, his silence no longer feeling like a threat, but like a deep, focused attention. She saw the man who cultivated life with such careful hands. He saw the woman who understood it without needing an explanation. The pull between them was undeniable, a magnetic force humming just beneath the surface of their quiet conversations about soil acidity and pruning seasons. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. One day, she was admiring a rare, black velvet orchid, its petals the color of a moonless night. "It's beautiful," she breathed, reaching out but not quite touching it. "They're so difficult to keep alive. One mistake, one moment of neglect, and they're gone." "I know." His voice was a low rumble, right behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. She froze, her hand still hovering near the flower. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He wasn't crowding her, but his presence consumed all the air around her. He reached past her, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He didn't touch the orchid. Instead, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric. A jolt, sharp and hot, shot up her arm, straight to her chest where her heart stuttered and seized. It was nothing more than a ghost of a touch, skin against skin for less than a second, but it felt like a brand. His fingers were calloused, the skin rougher than she would have imagined. The hand of a man who worked with the earth. The hand of a man who broke things. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. Her breath caught in her throat. She finally dared to look at him. The icy mask was gone. His gray eyes were dark, stormy, and fixed on her with an intensity that stripped her bare. He had felt it too. The spark. The sudden, terrifying flash of heat in their cold, silent world. The power dynamic had shattered in an instant. This was no longer about a contract or a secret garden. It was about the simple, undeniable truth of a man and a woman, standing so close together the air itself felt flammable. The strange heat from his touch lingered on her skin for days. It was a phantom warmth, a ghost of a connection that both terrified and thrilled her. For the first time, the balance of power between them felt different. He was no longer just a cold, untouchable crime lord. He was also the man with calloused hands who cultivated life in secret, a man who had looked at her like she was the only source of light in his dark world. The thought was dangerous. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, mesmerized by the beautiful, deadly drop. She tried to push it away, focusing on the simple, grounding tasks of her work. She drove to her shop early one morning, the sky still a soft, bruised purple. She felt a sliver of her old self returning, the pragmatic florist who just wanted to trim stems and feel the sun on her face through the front window. But there was no window. Violet slammed on the brakes, her van screeching to a halt in the middle of the empty street. Her heart stopped. Where the large, welcoming pane of glass should have been, there was just a jagged, gaping hole. The cheerful green paint of her doorframe was splintered. Shards of glass glittered like cruel diamonds all over the sidewalk, mixed with the torn petals of her window display. Her sanctuary had been violated. A strangled cry escaped her lips. She threw the van into park and scrambled out, her feet crunching on the debris. The cold morning air rushed into the shop, carrying the sickly sweet scent of dying flowers. Inside, it was chaos. Buckets were overturned, water pooling on the floor. Her beautiful, vibrant world had been torn apart. It was a desecration. Tears blurred her vision as she took a step inside, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. And then she saw it. Lying in the very center of the floor, placed with deliberate care amidst the wreckage, was a single white lily. Its stem was snapped. Its petals were bruised and turning brown at the edges. A dead flower. A message. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a statement, written in her language. It was meant for him. They had found his weakness, the one soft, gentle thing he had allowed into his world. They had found her. She didn't know how long she stood there, staring at the dead lily, the symbol of their first meeting now twisted into a threat. She didn't hear the silent approach of the car. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell over her. Patrick stood in the ruined doorway, his body a rigid line of fury. He wasn't looking at the damage. He was looking at her, his gray eyes sweeping over her, checking for injury with a terrifying intensity. Then his gaze dropped to the dead lily on the floor. The air grew impossibly cold. The icy efficiency she knew was gone, burned away by something far more frightening. It was a rage so pure and controlled it seemed to suck all the sound from the street. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw a brutal, sharp line. He looked at the shattered glass, the ruined flowers, the dead lily, and she saw the truth in his eyes. He saw this as an attack not on a shop, but on a sanctuary. An attack on the one piece of gentleness he was trying to possess. He moved then, his steps crunching over the glass. He didn't come to comfort her. He came to stand over the lily, looking down at it as if it were the body of his enemy. Who did this? His voice was a low, lethal whisper. Violet couldn't speak. She just shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. He didn't need her to answer. He already knew. This was his world, and it had finally come crashing into hers. He pulled out his phone, his thumb moving with swift, precise taps. He spoke one word into it. Now. He ended the call and looked at her, his face a mask of cold, deadly purpose. You're not safe here anymore. She saw it then. The glint of victory in his otherwise furious eyes. The threat was real, but it was also an opportunity. An excuse. You're coming with me, he said. It was not a request. It was the closing of a cage. You will stay at the villa, where I can protect you. She didn't pack a bag. There was no time, no choice. One of his silent, stone-faced men drove her van back to the villa while she was placed in the back of the black sedan, a prisoner in a leather-lined cage. The familiar, winding road to his fortress felt different this time. Before, it was a path to a job. Now, it was a one-way street, and she was leaving her entire life behind at the bottom of the hill. The silence in the car was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered her rising panic. At the villa, she wasn't led to the living room or the study. She was taken up a floating marble staircase to a long, empty hallway. The guard opened a door at the far end and gestured for her to enter. The room was beautiful, of course. A wall of glass offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city below. The bed was enormous, draped in crisp white linens. But the luxury was a mockery. It was the most beautiful prison cell in the world. Violet stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, listening as the guard's footsteps receded down the hall. She was alone, but his presence was everywhere, in the cold architecture, the sterile air, the suffocating silence. She felt like one of her cut flowers, placed in a crystal vase to be admired until she wilted. The door opened without a knock. Patrick stepped inside, his dark suit immaculate, his face an unreadable mask of control. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing like a lock turning. The sight of him, so calm and commanding in the cage he had built for her, finally broke her shock. A hot, furious energy surged through her. You wanted this, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Don't you dare pretend this is for my protection. You used this. He didn't flinch. He simply watched her, his gray eyes cold and assessing. The threat is real, Violet. The threat is your excuse. She shot back, taking a step toward him. My shop, my life, was torn apart this morning, and all you saw was an opportunity to lock me up in here. To own me completely. He moved toward her then, closing the space between them until only a few feet remained. The vast room suddenly felt small, charged with a dangerous, crackling current. He was a predator, and she was trapped. My enemies don't make distinctions, he said, his voice a low, chilling rumble. They saw you. They saw you coming here day after day. In their eyes, you are already mine. The only difference now is that you are behind my walls, where they cannot reach you. His words were a punch to the gut. The casual possessiveness, the brutal logic of his world, it was suffocating. I am not yours, she whispered, the words a fierce, desperate prayer. He took another slow step. He was so close now she could see the faint lines around his eyes, could smell the clean, sharp scent of his cologne. You entered my world the day you accepted my contract, the day you brought those lilies to my door. Did you really think you could touch my life and walk away clean? Tears of helpless fury burned her eyes. He was right. That was the most infuriating part. She had been naive, pragmatic to the point of blindness. She had taken the money, crossed the line, and this was the price. So this is it? She demanded, her voice cracking. I just live here now. Your pet florist locked in a tower? For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold control crossed his face. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, and the air between them grew thick, heavy with an unspoken, unwanted desire. "You will be safe here," he said, his voice rougher now. He turned and walked to the door, his back rigid. He paused with his hand on the handle. "This is my world, Violet. And now you are in it. Learn to survive." The door clicked shut, leaving her alone once more. She stared at the unblemished wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was wrong. This wasn't a world. It was a cage. And his presence was in every bar. Days bled into one another, each one a perfect, sterile copy of the last. The villa was a silent, gilded prison, and Violet felt herself starting to wilt. She paced the length of her room, the plush carpet a soft trap under her feet, the view of the city a constant, painful reminder of the world she had lost. She was safe, but she was suffocating. That evening, he appeared at her door. "Get your coat," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We have an event to discuss. Security logistics." A jolt of pure, terrified hope shot through her. To go outside. To breathe air that wasn't recycled. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the need to escape these four walls was stronger. She grabbed the thin jacket one of his staff had provided and followed him without a word. He didn't put her in the back of the sedan. He led her to a different car, a low-slung sports car that looked like a weapon carved from obsidian. He opened the passenger door for her, then slid into the driver's seat himself. The engine roared to life, a deep, predatory growl that vibrated through her bones. They descended the winding hill, and as the gates of the villa slid shut behind them, Violet took her first deep breath of night air. It was cool and sharp, thick with the scent of jasmine and exhaust fumes. It smelled like freedom. He drove them down into the heart of the city, a river of red and white lights flowing around them. Neon signs bled color across the windshield, electric blues, hot pinks, sickly greens. The city was alive, a pulsing, chaotic beast, and she had never been so happy to be in its belly. "The event is for a shipping consortium," Patrick said, his eyes fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "The client wants the arrangements to feel powerful but understated. What would you suggest?" It was a test. The conversation was too normal, too mundane for the tense reality of their situation. She felt like bait on a hook, being dangled in the open water. "Dark calla lilies," she answered, her voice tight. "Or deep purple irises. Something with a strong line." He nodded, but his focus wasn't on her words. His gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror. She followed his line of sight and saw it. A pair of headlights, two sharp, predatory eyes in the darkness behind them. They had been there since they left the freeway. A dark sedan, keeping a perfect, steady distance. A cold dread washed over her. "Patrick?" He didn't answer. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The predator had scented the bait. With a sudden, fluid movement, he wrenched the wheel, and the world outside became a violent blur of color. The car shot down a narrow side street, the powerful engine screaming in protest. Violet was thrown against her seat, her heart leaping into her throat. The other car followed, its movements heavy and clumsy in comparison. Patrick was no longer the icy businessman. He was something else entirely. His focus was absolute, his movements lethally precise. He wasn't just driving, he was hunting. He took another impossibly sharp turn into a dark alley, the sides of the car nearly scraping the brick walls. The squeal of the tires was deafening. He cut the headlights. For a terrifying second, they were plunged into near-total darkness, the only light coming from the mouth of the alley ahead. The rival car roared past the opening, caught off guard. In that instant, Patrick slammed the car into gear, shot out of the alley, and was behind them. It happened so fast she couldn't even process it. He didn't chase. He simply tapped their rear bumper, a gentle, calculated nudge that sent the sedan spinning out of control. It slammed sideways into a row of parked cars with a sickening crunch of metal. And then, it was over. Patrick drove on, his speed returning to normal, melting back into the river of traffic as if nothing had happened. The entire encounter had taken less than 30 seconds. The silence in the car was thick and suffocating. Violet's body trembled with leftover adrenaline, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at him. His expression was calm. His breathing was even. He looked as if he had just been deciding what to have for dinner. For the first time, she saw the violence he was capable of, not as a vague threat, but as a real, tangible, and terrifyingly efficient skill. She understood. The cage he kept her in wasn't an act of possessive cruelty. It was a necessity. His suffocating protection was the only thing keeping her alive in a world she never asked to be a part of. The bond between them shifted, solidifying into something new and frightening. It was forged in the heat of shared danger, in the screech of tires on neon-slick streets. He was a monster, but he was her monster. And tonight she had seen him bare his teeth. The adrenaline from the car chase had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard residue of truth. This was his world. Violence was its native language. For 2 days, Violet had stayed in her room, trapped not just by the locked door but by the terrifying realization that the cage was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his life, a passive object to be protected or broken. And she hated it. The feeling was a poison, seeping into her bones, more suffocating than the silence of the villa. She would not be a victim. She would not wait to be rescued or avenged. She was a pragmatist. A problem solver. Her tools were petals and stems, not guns and cars, but the principle was the same. You found the weakness. You found the root of the problem. Her phone. She had dropped it in her pocket that horrible morning at the shop. Her hands shaking, she scrolled through her photos, past pictures of blooming arrangements and smiling customers, until she found it. The image made her stomach clench. Her beautiful shop, violated and broken. In the center of the frame was the dead Lily. She had taken the photo in a moment of numb shock, an instinct to document the crime before Patrick's whirlwind of fury had erased everything. Now she forced herself to look at it not with the eyes of a grieving owner, but with the sharp, analytical gaze of a botanist. She zoomed in, her finger dragging the image across the screen until the snapped stem of the lily filled the display. And there it was. It was almost invisible to an untrained eye. A faint, dusty film near the base of the stem, clinging to the bruised tissue. A web-like pale mycelium. Her mind, a library of botanical knowledge, supplied the name instantly. Sclerotium ralphsii. Southern blight. It was a vicious fungus, a nightmare for growers of delicate bulbs. But it was also specific. It thrived in a particular type of peat-heavy, nutrient-rich soil mix favored by a handful of exclusive, high-end nurseries in the LA basin. The kind of places that supplied rare cultivars to luxury hotels and discerning clients. Her heart began to beat faster, a hard, steady rhythm of purpose. The rivals hadn't just grabbed a flower from a corner store. They had used a boutique supplier. They were meticulous, sophisticated. And they had made a mistake. They had left a clue, a single spore of evidence, that only she could read. She found him in his study. The room was dark, the only light coming from the cold glow of his laptop. He looked up as she entered, his gray eyes guarded, questioning her intrusion. For a moment, her courage faltered. He was the monster, the king of this dark world. She was just the florist. No. She straightened her shoulders and walked directly to his desk, placing her phone on the polished mahogany surface. "I know how to find them," she said, her voice clear and steady. He looked from her face to the phone, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He didn't speak, just raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The lily they left," she explained, tapping the screen to bring up the photo. "They made a mistake." She pointed to the faint residue on the stem. "This is a specific type of soil fungus. It's rare. It only grows in the soil mix used by about 3 nurseries in this entire county. Nurseries that specialize in exotic and expensive flowers. Your enemies have a supplier." The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. She could see the dismissal in his eyes, the instinct to brush off her theory as the desperate grasping of a frightened woman. He saw flowers as sentiment, as decoration. He didn't see them as evidence. "And what do you propose we do with this botanical lesson, Violet?" he asked, his tone laced with a cold, condescending patience. "They used my language to send you a message," she shot back, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised them both. "So I'm using it to read their reply. Your enemies are careful. They are meticulous. But so am I. This is a detail they overlooked. This is their mistake." He stared at her, truly stared at her, for the first time since she had presented her idea. The skepticism in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by something else. A dawning reassessment. He was looking at her not as a fragile obsession, not as a woman to be protected, but as a strategist. An asset. He saw the sharp, pragmatic intelligence that had kept her business afloat, now aimed like a weapon at his enemies. Slowly, he leaned forward, his gaze dropping from her eyes to the tiny clue glowing on her phone screen. He looked at it for a long, silent moment. When he looked back up at her, the dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. The captor and the captive were gone. In their place stood two reluctant partners in a very dangerous game. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble of acceptance. "Tell me your plan." The air in the study crackled with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the suffocating silence of a cage anymore. It was the charged, focused quiet of a war room. For the first time in weeks, Violet felt a surge of something other than fear. It was purpose. She was no longer a passive piece in his game. She was a player. "Here," she said, her voice steady as she pointed to a name on his laptop screen. He had pulled up a list of the 3 nurseries she'd identified. "Orchid Oasis. They have a reputation for being discreet and expensive. They supply half the luxury hotels in Beverly Hills. It's the most likely place." Patrick leaned back in his leather chair, his gray eyes fixed on her, the cold condescension completely gone. He was listening. Truly listening. "They'll be watching for my men. They won't be watching for me," Violet countered, a thrill of audacity running through her. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of his massive desk, claiming a space in his world. "I'm a florist. I'd buy flowers. It's the most normal thing in the world. I'll place a large, last-minute order for an event. Something specific and difficult, like 100 stems of black Baccarat roses. They'll have to prepare it for pickup." He was silent for a moment, his gaze unreadable. "They know your face, Violet. It's too risky to put you out in the open." "That's the point," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "They know the face of the woman you're keeping. They won't recognize the face of a professional, stressed about a demanding client, too busy to notice who else is in the loading bay. It's the perfect cover. Your men can watch from a distance. They just need to see who else is there, picking up an order that doesn't fit the usual floral shop traffic." He stared at her, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not obsession, but a grudging, sharp respect that felt infinitely more dangerous. More intimate. He was seeing her, the real her, for the first time. The pragmatic, capable woman who had built a business from nothing. And he was seeing how he could use that. He gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. The next hour was a blur of intense, focused collaboration. He pulled up satellite images of the nursery, and their 2 worlds collided over the glowing screen. He pointed out sight lines for surveillance, alleyways for escape routes. She pointed out the refrigerated loading docks, the employee entrances, the specific times of day when wholesale pickups were common. He spoke of risk and exposure. She spoke of invoices and delivery schedules. It was a strange, lethal fusion of botany and battle strategy. As they leaned closer to the screen, his shoulder brushed against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but the same electric heat from the greenhouse flared between them. Her breath hitched. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the clean, crisp scent of his shirt, of the quiet power that radiated from him. This was terrifying. But it was also exhilarating. She was trusting the monster to keep her safe while she helped him hunt other monsters. He straightened up, moving away from her, but his eyes held hers for a long moment. The unspoken thing that had sparked between them was still there, now complicated by this fragile, new alliance. "I'll make the call," Patrick said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. He picked up his phone. He didn't have to look up a number. He gave his orders in a calm, clipped tone, his words painting a picture of lethal efficiency. Men would move into position. A perimeter would be established. Every car, every person entering or leaving the nursery tomorrow would be catalogued. When he hung up, the plan was in motion. There was no turning back. He looked at her, his expression unreadable stone once more. "You'll be given a cover story. A new client. Memorize it." Violet simply nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The weight of what she had done settled on her. She had willingly taken a step deeper into the darkness, armed with nothing but her knowledge of flowers. She had put her trust in the hands of the very man who had taken her freedom, betting her life that he would not let her fall. The plan was a living thing now, a dangerous seed they had planted together in the sterile quiet of his study. For the first time since she'd been brought to the villa, Violet felt a sliver of control, a fragile sense of agency that was both terrifying and intoxicating. They were partners for now. Two sides of a very sharp coin. The call came the next morning, a complication she should have foreseen. A clipped, professional voice from Orchid Oasis informed her that, as a new client placing such a large and unusual order, they required a copy of her current business license for their records. A standard procedure. A bureaucratic hurdle that felt like a wall. Her license was pinned to a corkboard in the back office of her shop. Her shop, which was a crime scene, sealed and inaccessible. A cold, clean dread washed over her. The plan was going to crumble before it even began. She found Patrick in the greenhouse, tending to his orchids. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "There's a problem," she said, her voice tight. "The nursery needs my business license. It's in my shop, along with the original deed and all my other paperwork." He didn't react for a moment, simply staring at her, his gray eyes assessing the situation. She expected him to be angry, to see this as a failure on her part. Instead, he set down his pruning shears with quiet deliberation. "I'll get it. You can't just—" she started, but he was already walking past her. "Wait here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. She watched him go, a strange mix of emotions churning in her gut. He was going himself. Not sending one of his men. He was re-entering the space that had been violated because of him, to retrieve a piece of her life for a plan she had created. The lines between them were becoming impossibly blurred. He was gone for less than an hour. The wait was agonizing. She paced his study, the cage now feeling like a command center, the silence thick with anticipation. He returned as silently as he had left, holding a single, plain manila folder. He placed it on the polished surface of his desk without a word and stepped back, watching her. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The first few pages were familiar, recent invoices, tax forms, her business license clipped to the top. She carefully unclipped it, her relief so profound it made her feel lightheaded. The plan was still alive. Beneath the license was a thicker stack of papers, held together by a rusty staple. The original sale and deed transfer documents from when she had bought the shop years ago. She smiled faintly, a ghost of a memory. It had been the proudest day of her life. She idly flipped to the first page, the formal legal language a reminder of how far she had come. Her eyes scanned the document, landing on the line for the previous owner. The seller. And the world stopped. The name typed in the neat, black font was not the one she remembered from the realtor. This was the original owner, the one who had sold it to the holding company she'd bought it from. Elena Edwards. The name meant nothing. And then it meant everything. Edwards. A coincidence. It had to be. But her blood ran cold. She looked up at Patrick, who was still standing by the window, watching her with that unnerving stillness. She looked back down at the name. Elena Edwards. The lilies. His raw, unguarded reaction that first day. The secret, beautiful garden, a world of gentleness hidden behind a wall of stone. His obsession. It wasn't a predator stalking new prey. It was a ghost, reaching for a ghost. The entire architecture of their strange, terrifying relationship crumbled in an instant, revealing a foundation of pure, desperate grief. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible in the silent room. Who was Elena Edwards? The icy facade he wore like armor didn't just crack. It shattered. For a single, breathtaking moment, all the control, all the power, all the cold distance vanished, and he was just a man, laid bare by a name on a piece of paper. A raw, profound pain surfaced in his eyes, so deep it stole her breath. He finally spoke, his voice rough, stripped of its usual authority. She was my sister. Violet stared at him, the folder forgotten in her hands. This shop, it was hers. He continued, his gaze lost in a memory she couldn't see. She loved flowers. It was her escape from all of this. Her sanctuary. He made a vague gesture, encompassing the cold villa, the violence, the entire world he commanded. After she died, I couldn't bear to sell it. Not to anyone who knew. So I had it transferred to a company, let it go to a stranger. I just watched from a distance. His eyes finally met hers, and the vulnerability in them was a physical blow. And then you walked into my home. You brought her favorite flowers. You stood there, in the middle of all this emptiness, and for a second, I thought I had a chance to protect it again. To protect her memory. The truth hit her. His obsession wasn't for her. It was for what she represented. A second chance. A ghost of his sister, living and breathing in the one place she had been happy. He hadn't been trying to own Violet. He had been desperately, tragically trying to save Elena. The words hung in the silent study, heavy and fragile. She was my sister. The confession landed in Violet's chest not like a shock, but like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Everything clicked into place with a painful, silent snap. The lilies. The crystal vase. His raw, unguarded stare on that first day. The secret garden, a tender, living heart hidden in a body of stone. It was never about her. Not really. It was all for Elena. The monster in front of her seemed to shrink, the terrifying power he wielded receding to reveal the broken man underneath. The cage she was in suddenly felt different. It hadn't been built to trap her, it had been built to protect a ghost. His obsession wasn't the possessive fixation of a predator. It was the desperate, misguided grief of a brother who had lost the one gentle thing in his world and was now clinging to its echo. Violet looked from his face, now a mask of raw pain, to the deed in her hands. She was living in another woman's dream. The thought sent a strange, aching sympathy through her, a feeling so potent it completely eclipsed her fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. Patrick flinched, as if the simple kindness was a physical blow. He turned away from her, walking back to the window and staring out at the manicured lawn, his back a rigid wall of control. But it was too late. She had seen the cracks. She had seen the devastation he kept hidden behind them. "She was the only one of us who was good," he said to the glass, his voice rough. "She built that shop with her own hands. Every cracked floorboard, every sunny spot, it was hers. It was the only place the ugliness couldn't touch her." Violet's heart ached. The violation of her shop, of Elena's shop, now felt 1,000 times worse. It wasn't just an attack on her livelihood. It was a desecration of a dead woman's memory, a final, brutal act of violence against the sanctuary she had built. The dead lily left in the wreckage was no longer just a threat, it was a sacrilege. All the anger she had felt toward him for trapping her here dissolved, reforged into a cold, hard rage aimed at the men who had done this. They hadn't just shattered her window. They had trampled on a grave. She walked to the desk and placed the folder down with a quiet finality. The plan they had made was no longer just a strategy for her survival. It was something more. It was justice. For Elena. "The plan for tomorrow," she said, her voice clear and strong now, cutting through the heavy silence. It still stands. I'm still going. He turned slowly from the window, his eyes finding hers. The raw grief was still there, but something else was hardening over it, a cold, lethal purpose. He wasn't just neutralizing an enemy anymore. He was avenging his sister. They targeted her memory, he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. They chose that shop because they knew it would be like putting a knife in me. They just didn't know how deep it would go. A new understanding passed between them, silent and absolute. The complex dynamic of captor and captive, of obsession and resistance, was gone. In its place was a fragile, dangerous alliance forged in shared grief and a common enemy. He was no longer looking at her as a replacement for his sister. He was looking at her as an ally, the only person in the world who now understood the true stakes of this fight. They made a mistake, Violet said, her gaze as steady and determined as his. They thought they were attacking your weakness. They don't realize they just armed your greatest strength. He gave a single, sharp nod. The conversation was over. The partnership was sealed. Tomorrow, she would walk into the lion's den, not as bait, but as the hunter. And she would do it for the woman whose ghost lived among the flowers. The plan had worked perfectly. Too perfectly. Violet's part at the nursery had been a quiet, tense masterpiece of misdirection. She had played the role of a harried florist flawlessly, and Patrick's men had identified the rival boss, a man named Marco Valenti, his face a mask of cruel confidence. Now, that same man was walking onto the stone terrace outside the study, flanked by two of his soldiers, believing he was here for a truce. Violet watched from behind the heavy curtains of the study window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was supposed to be in her room, locked away and safe. But she couldn't. She had to see this. She had to witness the end of the war that had been waged in Elena's name. Patrick met them on the patio. He was dressed in a simple dark shirt and trousers, no suit jacket, as if he were merely greeting a guest for a casual drink. He looked relaxed, almost serene, which was the most terrifying thing about him. The glass house loomed behind him, its panes reflecting the late afternoon sun, a silent, glittering witness. Valenti, Patrick said, his voice a calm, even tone that carried clearly to where Violet stood. Thank you for coming. Edwards, Marco sneered, his eyes darting around the pristine garden, assessing. You wanted to talk terms. I'm here. So talk. Patrick smiled, a thin, cold curve of his lips that held no warmth at all. The terms are simple, he said, taking a half step back, a subtle, almost imperceptible signal. You don't get to leave my home. The betrayal was instant. Valenti's men were reaching for their weapons before the words had even finished echoing across the stones. But they were too slow. Patrick's men seemed to materialize from the shadows of the garden, moving with a silent, coordinated lethality. The world exploded into a chaos of motion. It wasn't loud, not like in the movies. It was a series of brutal, contained sounds, the wet thud of fists hitting flesh, a choked gasp, the sharp, metallic click of a weapon being disarmed. Violet's breath caught in her throat. She watched Patrick move, and it was like watching a different species. He was no longer the man who tended orchids with gentle hands. He was a predator, a blur of deadly efficiency. He took down one of Valenti's men himself, his movements fluid and precise, a brutal ballet that ended with the man crumpling silently to the manicured lawn. It was almost over. Valenti, his face a mask of shock and rage, managed to pull his gun free. He wasn't aiming for Patrick. He was aiming for the house. A wild, desperate shot meant to cause chaos. A deafening crack split the air. Violet flinched, a scream catching in her throat as a spiderweb of cracks erupted across a massive pane of the glass house. The sound of the bullet hitting the glass was followed by a terrible, musical crash as the entire section shattered, raining down onto the delicate plants inside. Shards of glass glittered like cruel diamonds on the soft petals of Elena's orchids. The world went silent. The fight was over. Valenti was on the ground, disarmed and held by two of Patrick's men. The pristine patio was now a scene of quiet carnage. But Violet couldn't look away from the glass house. The gaping, jagged hole in its side felt like a wound in her own chest. The beauty of his secret world, of Elena's sanctuary, had been violated. The violence he had tried so desperately to keep out had finally come crashing in. Patrick stood in the middle of it all, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His knuckles were bloody, a stark crimson against his pale skin. He wasn't looking at the defeated rival boss or the bodies of his men. His gaze was fixed on the shattered glass, on the desecration of his sister's memory. The icy control was gone, replaced by a look of such profound, hollow loss that it hurt to see. He had won the war, but in that single, shattering moment, she knew he felt he had lost everything that mattered. The fight was over. Through the window, Violet watched as the last of Valenti's men were silently and efficiently removed from the terrace, ghosts being erased from a crime scene. The quiet that followed was heavier and more chilling than the violence itself. Patrick hadn't moved. He stood alone on the stones, his back to the house, his bloody knuckles the only spot of color on his dark form. His gaze was fixed on the gaping, jagged hole in the side of his glass house. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom that had just turned to ash. She didn't know what possessed her, what cold, clear purpose hardened in her veins, but she could no longer just watch. She pushed open the heavy glass door of the study and stepped out onto the terrace. The air was sharp with the coppery scent of blood and the green, wounded smell of crushed leaves. He didn't turn. He didn't seem to know she was there. Violet walked past him, her steps silent, and went directly to the shattered sanctuary. She stepped through the broken opening, her shoes crunching on a carpet of glittering glass. Inside, the humid, warm air of the greenhouse was gone, replaced by a cool, invasive draft. Shards of glass littered the dark, rich soil. A perfect white orchid, one of Elena's favorites, had been decapitated by a falling piece of the wall, its single, beautiful bloom lying on the floor like a fallen soldier. The destruction was absolute. This perfect, secret world of life had been irrevocably scarred by his world of death. She heard a soft crunch of glass behind her, and knew he had followed her in. He stopped just a few feet away, the space between them humming with a terrible, silent grief. He still hadn't spoken. He just stared at the ruined orchid on the floor. Violet finally turned to face him. Her fear was gone, burned away by a cold, searing clarity. This had to end. "You say you are protecting your sister's memory," she began, her voice not a whisper, but a clear, steady statement that cut through the broken silence. She gestured with her hand, a sweep that took in the shattered glass, the dead flower, the gaping wound in the wall. "But you brought the war to her sanctuary. Your obsession is destroying the very thing you claim to cherish." His eyes, dark with a pain so deep it looked like a physical wound, finally lifted to meet hers. He opened his mouth to speak, but she gave him no room. "Look at this place," she commanded, her voice gaining a sharp, undeniable strength. She reached down and gently touched a broad green leaf, brushing away a shard of glass that had sliced into its surface. "You wanted to keep her world pure, but you cannot. Your life is a poison, Patrick. And everything you touch, everything you try to protect, eventually gets poisoned by it." She took a step closer to him, closing the distance until she could see the reflection of the broken glass in his stunned, gray eyes. This was it. The true confrontation. Not with guns and fists on a patio, but here, with words and truths in a ruined garden. "So you have to choose," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. "You have to make a choice right now. Not for me. For her." She held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let him hide. "Either you let me go," she said, each word a carefully placed stone. "You let me walk away from all of this, back to her shop, and you let her legacy live on freely through me. Or you keep me here. You continue this suffocating protection, and you watch as your world inevitably consumes and destroys me, and this garden, and every last beautiful thing she ever loved. You will be the one who finishes the job they started today." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, stark and absolute. free the memory, or smother it to death. His face was pale, his expression shattered. Her words had hit him harder than any bullet, striking the one vulnerable place he had left. He looked from her face to the ruined orchid on the floor, then back to the gaping hole in the glass wall. He finally saw it. He saw the truth. To truly honor a gentle spirit, you could not keep it in a cage of violence. He had brought the war to the one place of peace, and in his desperate attempt to protect his sister's ghost, he had nearly destroyed it. His face was a battlefield. Violet watched as every emotion she had ever seen in him, the cold control, the raw obsession, the flicker of vulnerability, warred for dominance in his gray eyes. Her words hung in the broken air of the glass house, a verdict he could not escape. He was the poison. He was the destruction. The truth of it was a brutal, physical force, and she saw it land, saw him stagger under its invisible weight. He looked away from her, his gaze falling to the decapitated orchid on the floor. He stared at the single, perfect bloom lying amidst the glittering shards of glass, and something inside him seemed to collapse. The rigid line of his shoulders softened. The brutal tension in his jaw went slack. He looked at the ruin he had allowed, the desecration of the one pure thing he had tried to protect. He had brought the war home. When he finally looked back at her, the fight was over. All that remained was a vast, hollow emptiness. A defeat so absolute it was a kind of peace. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a surrender. It was an acceptance. A final, silent acknowledgement of the truth she had forced him to see. He would not be the one to finish the job. He would not be the one to destroy his sister's last legacy. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the ruined greenhouse, his steps crunching softly on the glass. He didn't look back. Violet stood for a moment longer, the cool air washing over her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm of disbelief. He had chosen. He had chosen Elena. The next morning, he was waiting for her at the bottom of the marble staircase. He wasn't in a suit. He wore a simple black sweater, and he held a set of car keys in his hand. He didn't speak. He just inclined his head toward the front door. This was it. He drove her himself, the same low-slung sports car they had taken on that terrifying night. The journey down the winding hill was a funeral procession in reverse, taking her away from the mausoleum and back toward the world of the living. The silence in the car was a physical presence, a third passenger made of unspoken goodbyes and things that could never be. Violet stared out the window at the blur of palm trees and sun-bleached houses, every inch of road taking her further away from the cage. She risked a glance at him. His hands were steady on the wheel, his profile as sharp and severe as ever, but there was a profound weariness in the set of his mouth. He looked like a man who had just buried the last piece of his heart. He pulled up to the curb in front of her shop. The shattered front window was now covered with a large, ugly sheet of plywood, but it was still standing. It was still hers. The engine idled, a low, mournful rumble in the quiet morning. This was the moment. The final transaction. He didn't turn to her. He just stared straight ahead through the windshield, at the boarded-up dream that had started all of this. He pressed a button, and the soft click of the door unlocking was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She put her hand on the handle, her breath catching in her throat. She had to look at him one last time. She turned her head, and his gray eyes met hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by a deep, aching loss. There was no apology in his gaze, but there was an understanding. And a final, silent farewell. Violet opened the door and stepped out onto the familiar, cracked sidewalk. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for him to speak words that would never come. She simply stood there, breathing in the dusty city air, and listened. The engine revved once, a deep, guttural sound. Then the car pulled away from the curb, its shadow sliding away from her feet. It accelerated down the street, a black shape disappearing into the bright LA morning, never slowing, never stopping, until it was gone. She was free. 6 months later. The thought came to her as she wiped down her new front window, the glass cool and solid under her palm. 6 months since the plywood had come down, since the silence had ended. The bell above her door chimed, a cheerful, constant music that had replaced the heavy quiet of the villa. Petal and stem was more than just alive, it was thriving. The morning rush was a chaotic dance of regulars grabbing coffee break bouquets and new clients drawn in by the explosion of color that spilled onto the sidewalk. Violet moved through it all with a new kind of grace. The subtle, deep-seated loneliness that had once haunted the edges of her days was gone, burned away in the fire of the last year and replaced with a quiet, unshakable strength. She was her own woman, rooted in her own soil. The memories of him, of the cold villa and the secret, wounded garden, were not gone. They were scars, pale and silver under her skin, a permanent reminder of the darkness she had walked through and, somehow, walked out of. Her integrity was intact. Her agency was her own. She was a queen in her own small, beautiful kingdom. As the morning rush subsided, she began her favorite ritual. Every day, just as the sun began to warm the streets, she would find them. They were always in the same spot, propped carefully against her doorframe, wrapped in simple brown paper. A perfect, unnamed bouquet of fresh white lilies. This morning was no different. She opened the door, and there they were, their waxy petals still beaded with morning dew, their scent a clean, sharp perfume in the city air. There was never a card. Never a message. She never saw the delivery. They simply appeared in the quiet space between the last star and the first ray of sun, a silent, daily miracle. For the first few weeks, they had made her heart seize with a familiar, cold dread. She half expected the black card to reappear, for the anonymous gift to be the first link in a new chain. But it never was. The car never came. The silence was never broken. She came to understand what they were. Not a claim, but a promise. Not a chain, but a respectful, impossible distance. It was a sign that the lion was still watching over the lily, not as a possessor, but as a guardian from shadows she could no longer see. Violet knelt and gathered the bouquet into her arms, the cool stems familiar against her skin. She brought them inside, the scent of them filling her shop, a fragile ghost of his world mingling with hers. She didn't own a crystal vase. She unwrapped the lilies and trimmed their stems, placing them one by one into a simple, clear glass cylinder. She set the arrangement in the newly replaced front window, where the morning light could shine through their translucent petals. They were beautiful. A silent testament to a debt, a memory, and a choice. A piece of his darkness, now living peacefully in her light. She looked at them for a long moment, then turned away. A customer needed help choosing between the roses and the peonies. The phone was ringing with a new order. Her kingdom was calling. Violet smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and got back to work. If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.